Okay, Ricardo, I'm gonna put you on live stream. Take a few minutes, tell us who you are, why you're running, all of that, and then we can do some Q&A.
Perfect. I was gonna ask if there's Q&A. Can you hear me loud and clear? I'm in the car.
Yes.
All right, perfect. So my name is Ricardo Arroyo. I'm running for Suffolk County District Attorney. Before this, I was a public defender. I'm currently a city councilor. And in doing the work as a public defender, I really got frustrated with sort of the systemic injustice that I saw built into our systems. And that led me to run for the Boston City Council, because I said at the city council level, I can start to work on policy and reform to sort of attack the systemic things that are causing folks to come into need of a public defender in the first place. I was really proud of my time, and I'm still on the council, but I'm really proud of what I've succeeded in doing in the 3 years that I've been there in terms of the surveillance oversight, the facial recognition ban, racism as a public health crisis, the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency. And so these are the sorts of things that I saw myself doing there. As a public defender in 2017, Rachel Rollins was running to be the DA for Suffolk County. I was a public defender at the time, and I remember being really, truly excited about the ability of a DA to really do something to change the way in which our system creates racial and class disparity, and the way in which it really does prey on those who are most at risk and most in need of resources and help, and in the ways in which it really doesn't treat victims very well. It doesn't give them agency. It doesn't take care of them to a degree that I thought it was capable of doing. And I saw Rachel as somebody who could be sort of move us forward, and she did that in 3 years. When she left, it caused myself to really look at where we were at this moment when it came to criminal justice reform in our Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. There's an appointment who's there now who I'm running against. In his first month, he fired the Chief Innovation Officer. He demoted the person who was in charge of the wrongful conviction unit, the Conviction Integrity Review Bureau. They froze the drug lab plan. And so I was looking at all of those things. I was hearing calls for progressive prosecution, and I really made a decision with myself about whether or not I was willing to sit on the sidelines and wait for somebody else in whatever amount of time it took, 4, 8, 10, 12 years, whenever that happened, to continue the work that we had just started getting done. More work in regards to criminal justice reform in the last 3 years than I've seen in my entire time. And I had determination that I wasn't willing to do that. We see something like 20 to 25,000 cases in Suffolk County a year. That's 100,000 people in a term who are impacted by our criminal justice system, not counting victims in cases in which they exist, families on both sides. That's many people. And so I saw this as an opportunity to really do great work. I'm happy to answer any and all questions about my plans, my ideas, the things that I would like to keep moving forward on, and things where I think we can do some change. But I'll end the intro there because I really want to maximize Q&A time.
Great. Thank you so much. And then the floor is now open for questions. If people want to, feel free to put your question in the chat, unmute and ask your question yourself, or use the hand raise function. Any questions? I'm happy to seed a question. I'm always happy to seed questions of my own. Okay, I'll seed some questions of my own. So coming into the office, so with both with kind of currently succeeding kind of the interim DA Kevin Hayden, as well as succeeding Rachel Rollins, how would you describe what you would be like as a district attorney as both similar and different to the two immediate predecessors?
So let me start with Rachel. I think similarly, to do criminal justice reform in a law enforcement role, which is what this is, it requires a certain level of courage to say and do things, and then to follow through on them. And so I think Rachel embodied that in a really big way when it came to the list of 15, which I helped her write, which is the rebuttable presumption list, of which Rachel then did something that I intend to do as a district attorney, which is she opened up all of the data of how cases and what cases are being prosecuted, and how cases and their outcomes are what their outcomes are, and how those outcomes are playing out over the course of time. In the instance of the do not charge list or the rebuttable presumption list, that list under Rachel, it used to be that 60% of cases on that list were not charged under Dan Conley. Under Rachel Rollins, just because she put it in written policy, I'm the only candidate in this race who has said I will continue it as a written policy. Under that, it went up to 74%, a 14% increase. Over the last 10 years, they did a study out of Harvard on what the results of that were. People who were not charged on that do not charge list of infractions, 74% of them never came back with a felony ever in that 10 years. 64% never came back with a misdemeanor, which means 64% of the time, folks, because they were not charged, were able to stay out of this court system, were able to get the resources they needed to stabilize their lives, were able to reduce crime in the long run. And we've seen that play out statistically as well with the decreases in crime under Rachel Rollins' watch. And so those are the kinds of things that I want to continue to do and push. The transparency of the data, the transparency of written policies for change, those things. I think from the standpoint of the current district attorney, he's been there for a very short amount of time, but he's taken a couple stances. One of his stances has been to support, at least sort of unofficially, because he doesn't have a website with stances. So I have to sort of piece it together based off of some interviews he's given and some he hasn't. He's been very clear that he will not continue the do not charge or the rebuttable presumption list. He's done an interview where he said he supported police and schools. I oppose that. He's done another interview where he seems to suggest he supported qualified immunity. I oppose qualified immunity. So there are pretty big distinctions between myself and him. One of the things that I think is particularly galling for me at the moment is Rachel Rollins' Conviction Integrity Review Bureau had in her time 9 people exonerated for wrongful incarcerations totaling something like 450 years total. The director of that was a DA by the name of David Lewis. Within his first month there, he had demoted Mr. Lewis and had replaced him. One of the last cases that Rachel Rollins put before the court was the case of Stephen Pina. Stephen Pina had done 28 years. The judge found that there was police and prosecutorial misconduct in this case, has released Mr. Pina, who is now home, and there's a pending a hearing for a new trial. I would have assented to a new trial already. District Attorney Hayden has not taken a position on that and has refused to do so as of this date. We're now about a month out of the time in which Mr. Pina has been released. And that was a case that was put forward from David Lewis and that Integrity Review Board. And so there's things like that internally that are happening that I would certainly handle differently. And I think have a real impact on people's lives and justice in the county. And there's, I'm happy to go into any other things that have happened. I just saw, for instance, yesterday, a whole press release about those 2 children. There's multiple children, but 2 of them were 13 years old. And both of them clearly are in trauma, clearly are acting out in a way in which tells me that they have really important and big needs mentally and at home. And what happened most recently is a press release from the district attorney's office that he has charged one 13-year-old with 14 counts, another 13-year-old with 9 counts, and both of them were held on, one on a $5,000 bail at 13 years old, another on $3,500 bail on 13 years old. And that elicited a press release, like to be something to be proud of. And I don't think that's the direction and the way in which we should be leading. I don't think that's how you handle children in trauma, by giving them more trauma. And so these are the kinds of differences that I think are really important, the kinds of things that led me to run. And I think the sort of differences between how I would run that office and how it is currently being run.
Margaret, do you want to ask a question?
I think you just answered it.
Okay.
You must have guessed my mind, Ricardo. I said, what are the differences you foresee the acting incumbent in terms of changes in policies? Let me clarify one. Is he suggesting that, the police are still in the Boston schools, they're just in khakis, and they're no longer police? It's the same guys. People keep saying, put the police back.
They got a new name. They
have a new name. Yeah, they have a new name, and they're angry that they're not called police anymore. But is he now suggesting they get back into the police department? Is that what
it's hard? I think that is what he did a conversation with the Roxbury Children's Services and answered that he believed that, police have to have some role in that, but he was very sort of hard to pin down. He doesn't have a website with policies up. He hasn't. Well, I'm hoping for a forum this month. I would love to have a compare and contrast of where we are on issues and why we are where we are on issues. So I can't answer that in any real way because he hasn't really illuminated or done anything in depth there.
Yeah, I think it's a red herring that people use the police in the schools and they don't really understand what's going on. So that's too bad that he's even talking that way, but we'll see.
I think a lot of it is, I agree with you. I think it's a red herring. I personally went to our schools. I will say that there's data on this that you can look it up. There's a study from 2017 that found that police in schools did not actually reduce school incidents, but it did wildly increase the amount of Black and Latino children who found their way into our juvenile system. And so no decrease in criminal incidents or incidents period, but a wild increase in how many children of color interact with our criminal justice system, which once you get stuck in that system, it is incredibly difficult to remove somebody from it and to remove sort of the impacts that has on the rest of their life. And so those are the kinds of things that I think we just need somebody who's much more surgical and much more prepared to look at that in a way that takes into account the science, the data, all of the brain chemistry things, all of the ways in which policy sort of hits the ground, the practical impacts on people's lives. And it's sort of willing to avoid the noise. There's a lot of noise about why we need more police in schools and why that works, but we already had them there. And we actually have less incidents now. If you look at that actual Globe article they wrote about, it was like a Globe article basically talking about police not being in schools. And somewhere on paragraph 6, they mentioned that we're actually at less incidents by like hundreds from pre-COVID years. And that's it. So all of that stuff is alarmist to me. A lot of that stuff is agenda driven. And so being able to drown that out, being able to say what I'm saying to you in this room, on any room, and this is recorded, this is going to get played out, I know that. Being just very clear about what I say and why I'm saying it, I think is incredibly important in a district attorney's role to push things at the state house, to push things. I saw one of the questions there was what 2 laws or things I would repeal. There's 2 that I would look at. One is I intend to move forward with never asking for cash bail on nonviolent offenses. I think the fact that you can have somebody who can pay a bail, and I just want to be clear from a public defender standpoint, I'm going to walk you from beginning to end. I get charged, and let's say DA Hayden gets charged. Same people, same charge. I can't afford $5,000 bail. He can. He goes home. Next court date, he's back in court with a suit on. His attorney's been able to get him into programming, been able to get him into things that he can then argue to that judge, Your Honor, throughout the entirety of this time, he's been able to come in and out. You see, he's not going anywhere. He hasn't been a danger. He's doing all these programming. I can't because I can't pay the bail. We have the same charge, same issue. So now I'm coming in shackles every time you see me. I'm coming in from the jail. There's no ability for me to start my programming or to get credit for doing things the way I should be doing them as my case is pending. And what ends up happening in the data that we've seen is that when somebody is held on bail, they end up having worse outcomes, even on the same charges, even with the same records, even with the same makeup, racially, gender, age. They get different outcomes because they are showing up in the court, and there's a whole bunch of micro biases and things that start to play when you're actually held as opposed to released. Most folks that I had when I was a public defender were trying to plea out of cases that would never have given them any jail time, period. Worst case scenario, they're not seeing jail, but because they can't pay a bail, they're seeing jail. And so their goal is to give up their constitutional right to then go forward with a plea so that they don't have to serve any time just on the basis of bail. It's coercive, it's harmful, and it's literally just making it so that there's 2 different justice systems for people with money and people without. I would move forward with the bill at the House currently that ends mandatory, that ends cash bail, and I will put things in place as DA to sort of work around that as best I can while I'm DA. Judges still get to set bail, but we won't be requesting it on certain offenses. And then the second one is life without parole. When I was younger, I read a book that had a really big impact on me. I was in high school. I read a book called The Long Way Gone by Ishmael Bea. It was a book about a child soldier in Sierra Leone who had been sort of taken in as a child soldier at about the age of 11 or 12, had been supplied with drugs, had raped people, had killed people in this role, had been taken out and rehabilitated, and is now a professor in New York at a college, had written this Pulitzer-winning book. And so out of that book, the book wanted me to get the horrors of child soldiers, which obviously came through loud and clear. But what I really thought about was all the people who I had grown up with, who had been drawn into gangs, who had brought into these sort of different things, and were never given a chance to rehabilitate because they were given such severe sentences and were essentially locked up in a way where it completely changed the outcome of their lives. And I said to myself, I truly believe that any individual, especially if this person is capable of getting to a place where they're productive and healthy and in a place where they're giving back to society, that anybody can do that. So I would work towards repealing life without parole. It's currently a bill that we have at the House. I think everybody should get a chance at parole. Everybody should get a chance to prove that they are rehabilitated, that they are willing and able to be productive members of society, and we should be doing everything in our power to ensure that they are. And so I would push for ending those two things: life without parole and cash bail.
Great, thank you. Any other questions that folks have in the chat? Carol, and then quickly to Sarah's question in the chat, it'll be, I'm streaming it to the Ward 4 Dems Facebook page in case you want to watch it after.
So I think it was a poll that I heard this morning talking about how, across the country, people are being encouraged to, this is another red herring issue, think about crime with a capital C as the most pressing and urgent issue ever. Again, how do you message around that? I mean, nobody's looking to someone in this position to downgrade the severity of crime, but how do you provide balance in the way you message around this big ball of confusion called crime? You're muted, by the way.
It wouldn't be Zoom. I said that's a great question. One of the things I've told folks, and I'm going to answer this sort of in a short answer and then a long answer. One of the things I've told folks is folks who are against progress in criminal justice reform, folks who are against sort of where we've started to go and the results we've started to see, which in Suffolk County, we can point to a really strong record of progressive reforms leading to actually less crime, and better outcomes for individuals, both victims and folks who have been caught up in the system, is that when the vitriol gets ratcheted up to a 10 or 11, when the press is saying, look at all this crime, this person's soft on crime, they're gonna make it worse. When they're doing all of that, there's a tendency on our side to shrink and to try and say, no, I'm not as progressive as that. I'm not talking about that. Don't put me there. I have been really firm in that we need people who are going to be as brave and as loud about criminal justice reform as they are to take away the progress we've made. Somebody needs to stand behind what we're doing because it works, because it is the right thing to do, not just for criminals in the way in which they term it. These are individuals, these are human beings. And for the families that are impacted by this, one of the things that I know, this is all very deeply personal to me as a public defender, because the folks that I had who I represented today as a defendant, that the Commonwealth was trying to do everything they could to put away for as long as they could or to make life as hard as they could. Yesterday, they were the victim. Yesterday, they were the victim in a case. But today, they're the defendant because we're talking about cycles of trauma. And then tomorrow, they're a victim again. And so if you really want to talk about doing this in a real way, what I've tried to talk about is the fact that victims don't just belong. So when people talk about victims of crime, they tend to say that progressive reformers like myself don't care about victims, don't see them in the same light, that we care more about folks who have been charged with crimes than we do with folks who have been hurt or harmed by the person before the court. And the fact of the matter is that's not true. They don't get to own that. What I know for a fact is that the way that our system has worked in the past has actually made, in my view, people who I've spoken to, people who have gone through this system, feel like they've lost autonomy twice, like they've been victimized not just by the person who is sitting at the defendant's table, but by the system itself, who has forced them into what the case is going to look like, what their interaction in that case is going to look like. In some cases, in order to secure their attendance at a trial that they did not want, they've had threatened, there's been people who've been threatened with DCF, people who've been threatened with criminal charges themselves. These kinds of coercive methods don't just stop at a defendant, they stop They also impact people who've been harmed. One of the things that I also really care about is that when we talk about wrongful convictions, of which there have been many exposed under Rachel Rollins, that means that the person who did this harm, that this family is seeking closure on, is still not caught, or if they are caught, they're not being held responsible for the event that led to whatever that situation is for that family, whether it's a rape or a murder or whatever that is. And so with Rachel, when you did the 15, one of the things folks really don't understand is we have 170 attorneys at the district attorney's office. You get 20 to 25,000 cases a year. When you're talking about resources, they are not infinite. And so if you are focusing on shoplifting or trespass or possessions of class A's or B's or things that should be going to resources like housing and jobs and rehabilitation and mental health, what that does is what it did for Rachel, allowed her to create the Conviction Integrity Review Bureau. That didn't exist before. It allowed her to create PUSH, which dealt with unresolved crime. We have one of the lowest in all of the country murder solve rates, one of the lowest, which means we have a lot of cold case files. In her 3 years, Rachel was able to solve 3. All of them, one was over 30 years old, the other 2 were over 25 years old, just because she had the resources to put a district attorney on those things. If I had to ask somebody, and this gets back to the messaging about, downplaying crime. If I had to ask somebody, if you had to choose between going as hard as we could on somebody who's shoplifting because they are poor and they're taking toiletries from a Target, or giving them resources so we can focus on solving murders and homicides, which one makes more sense? Which one sounds radical to you? Would it be ignoring those unsolved homicides so that you could focus all your resources on the shoplifting and these lower level crimes? Or would it be the person who says these things are disruptive to our communities, these things are a problem? I think the other thing that I have brought up, which I haven't brought up here, but I brought up in the past, is that when we do this stuff, I want to live as safe as you do. I want my communities as safe as you do. There are things that I think are truly disruptive to our communities. That includes shootings, both non-fatal and fatal. 1 in 7 shootings are fatal, so that leaves 6 that are non-fatal. The city of Boston has a clearance rate on non-fatal shootings anywhere between 4% and 17%. That's because we don't put enough resources in it. And I know that not because I'm just saying that, but because the Department of Justice did a study on non-fatal shootings for the city of Boston, using the city of Boston's Boston Police Department as resources and data, where they found that non-fatal shootings can be solved just as highly as fatal shootings can be solved, but we don't put the resources in it. And that non-fatal shootings lead to fatal shootings in the future. So focusing on non-fatal shootings is actually preventative. So one of the things that I presented and proposed is that by continuing Rachel's policies when it comes to the list of 15 rebuttable presumptive charges, we can then create a non-fatal shooting task force where we dedicate resources to do that. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. And I think that nobody would say that creating a task force on solving unsolved non-fatal shootings is somehow soft on crime in any way, shape, or form, but it's facilitated by the fact that we're smarter on how we handle other crime at different levels. And I think that that's nuanced. And so when you're doing a nuanced conversation, I can give you sort of the 5 minutes on that. If I'm not giving you a nuanced conversation, what I can say is that these policies lead to less crime. They lead to reduced crime, while also ensuring that we are not criminalizing people simply because they are poor, mentally ill, or dealing with addiction and substance use disorders. And so if we're talking about this in a real way, that's how I would do that in about 5 seconds. And then if you want to go into a deeper dive on that, we could do that sort of point by point. But
Ricardo, you're did he just okay. Okay, we can Ricardo, I think we just lost you for a second.
I'm here.
Okay.
Did you not hear me at all? Because that would be awful.
No, that was an incredible answer, and thank you very much for the depth of it. I appreciate that. We all appreciate
Thank you, Carol.
Yep.
What I will just say to folks, because I know people here care a lot, right? To me, it's a pretty sad day because of the news that came out of the Supreme Court, and to have folks here engaged in this way is really important to me. What I will tell everybody on this is that It was never my first goal to be the prosecutor for Suffolk County District, for Suffolk County or period. I went into public defense. I went into this because I care really deeply about my communities and how they're treated by our law enforcement, which includes the prosecutor's office, but also the fact that we have many people in my communities and where I live and where I've grown up who have been in deep need of resources their entire lives, whether it's mental health resources or how you go about this. My vision, the best way to boil down what I believe is people are good. Generally speaking and genuinely speaking, people are naturally good. They're not naturally bad. And so when you think about that, when you think about people's intricate, like what they are, when somebody acts in an antisocial manner, I believe it's because there's resources and things that we have not provided them. It's either a hierarchy of needs, or they haven't received mental health treatment that we should have provided. They haven't received any of the things that societally would have made them whole, would have sort of contained and worked on that trauma and those needs. When they act out, the best way to ensure that we are creating safer communities is to meet those needs. If you believe in this from the other standpoint of this, then you believe that the only thing that makes people behave and work in a way that is sort of towards the social good is fear of consequences, fear, rules and regulations and all of these things. That's what forces people to be good. I think that's wrong. I think it's flawed. And so when you come from that standpoint, you think things like, if I give people higher mandatory minimums, then that means that other people won't do bad because they saw me do that to this person. And it entirely avoids all of the reasons that lead people to crime and lead people to do bad things in society from an antisocial standpoint. What I truly believe is that when people do harm, you have my word that there will be accountability for that harm that they have caused, but it will be accountability that ensures that when they come back to society, as something like 95% of folks who are incarcerated come back to society, right? 95%. When we are talking about that, it's deeply important that we get it right, that we get what their sentence is right, that we get what services we provide to them right, whether they even need sentences and what they need is probation and supervision and different sort of resources. All of those things make a difference. And I'll just share one story of my time as a public defender that sort of illustrates that. I had a high school student who had turned 18 that week when I was a public defender. His friends were all 17. He and his friends broke into his high school. Breaking into his high school in this case just meant opening the door and walking in. Triggered a bunch of alarms. Everybody ran. Police showed up. They arrested him and another friend. The other friend was 17, so he went to juvenile and they took care of that. He was 18 and they were mad that he wouldn't give up the friends that they didn't catch. And so they charged him. They overcharged him. And that overcharge meant that this kid who was 18, no record, had written this high school essay about wanting to be in the Air Force so he could go to the state police. This kid was then threatened with deportation because he had a green card to a country he'd never been to. It took me a year and a half to get a DA to agree to dismiss those charges. I had a letter from the superintendent, a letter from his principal, all of his teachers, a year and a half. That kid is now in the Air Force. I hope he ends up joining and doing what he wants to do with his life. That's join the state police. But the difference between him being deported and him going into the Air Force and having a productive life was that I was able to convince a brand new DA a year and a half into that case that this was a travesty to do this to this kid's life. And we got the result we wanted. That's the power of a DA. That's the power of discretion. That's what I want to make sure we bring to bear every day in Suffolk County courts.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I probably going to move on since we have a few other speakers this evening, but I want to thank, before we go, if people want to learn more about your campaign, where should they go?
www.votearroyo.com, ARROYO, votearroyo.com. And we have policies on there. We do. We're going to be adding more as we go, but there's already a whole policy section.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining. I got a round of kind of like Zoom applause for Councilor Arroyo. Okay. Next speaker that we have in the queue, Mark Martinez, running for state representative. Mark, I'll put you on spotlight. Okay, you can take a few minutes, tell us who you are, why you're running, and then after that, Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep the beginning brief because I'd rather have questions. But I'm running for state representative in the 7th Suffolk District, which includes most of Roxbury, as well as parts of Mission Hill and Fenway. And I'm running because I'm ready to bring a sense of urgency to the things that are most important to this district. And when I think about the things that are most important, the things that people tell me are most important, they're also the areas that I have the most experience in. So it's talking housing justice, environmental justice, and redefining what it means when we talk about public safety. And I think I bring a really rare combination of professional and lived experience to all of those fights. I spent the last 3 years prior to my run serving as legal counsel to State Senator Pat Jalen. So I spent the past 3 years in the building drafting and passing legislation in all these areas, because they're all areas that are really deeply personal to me. When it comes to fighting for housing justice, I've been unhoused. I know the trauma that comes with that. I know the trauma that comes with housing instability. And I brought that lived experience to the State House, where I helped draft and pass legislation to prevent thousands of evictions during the pandemic, to fight for legislation on transfer fees, on right of refusal to preserve affordable housing, on rent control, on just cause evictions, and building truly affordable housing. We can't keep on building housing at 80% of the area median income and calling it affordable, because we know that it's not. It's especially not affordable for this district, where the AMI in Roxbury is $35,000 and 80% of AMI is $67,000. We can't. That's not cutting it anymore. When it comes to the fight for environmental justice, I'm a Black man, I'm a Puerto Rican man, which means at birth, I was 14 times more likely to be born with asthma, which I was, right, which is a direct result of environmental factors, the impacts of pollution on communities of color, and is also the part of the reason why the COVID-19 pandemic hit our communities so hard, and part of the reason why there's a 30-year life expectancy difference between Roxbury and the Back Bay. That's 3 T-stops, and there's a 30-year life expectancy difference. And so I've passed legislation to mitigate the impacts of pollution on communities of color. And lastly, I think the one that is probably most personal to me is redefining what it means when we talk about public safety, which is a lot of the conversation you all just had with Councilor Arroyo. For too long, public safety has been defined by the number of police officers that we have in the street, the number of people being ripped from community and incarcerated. And I know that that is not how we can define public safety. I grew up in a home with an incarcerated mother. I spent much of my childhood visiting my mother from the other side of a piece of plexiglass. And so I know that did not make us safe. I know that over-policing didn't make me, my community, my family safe. I lost my father 2 years ago to his addiction to an overdose. Which again is directly related to him not getting the services and the treatment that he needed, and instead being met with over-policing and incarceration. And inside the State House, I think the thing that I'm most proud of, there was a big conversation recently with Councilor Arroyo about police in schools. During the police reform debate, the office that I was working at the time passed an amendment that finally allowed schools to make the choices about whether or not they wanted police in schools. It was mandated by law for a very long time that every school district have a school resource officer or a police officer in school. We passed that amendment, which is what freed cities and towns like Brookline and Somerville to end their school resource officer program, which is something that I am really proud of and really passionate about. And so I'll leave it at that. And I'm happy to answer questions about any of the things that I just talked about, or really any of the things that are important to you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So anybody questions, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. You can use the hand raise function, or you can drop a question in the chat. And I am happy to seed questions of my own if nobody has one to start. Question I'll seed from my own. So one thing that's always been striking to me when observing the Massachusetts State House is the dominant force of inertia in Massachusetts state politics, where here in Massachusetts, we have, I believe it's now the second largest Democratic supermajority in the country after Hawaii. I think we've now passed Rhode Island. And one would think that would mean Massachusetts is a hotbed of passing progressive policy, but often things end up stuck for a number of different reasons. Question to you is, what you view as some of the biggest obstacles to passing progressive policy in the Massachusetts legislature, and what would be your strategies to overcome said obstacles?
I think there's a lot. I think there's obviously a lot of obstacles. I think it's a couple of things. I think one, people with the lived experiences with the issues that we are most that are most important don't get elected. Right, the pathway is not there for them. And I think too. I think at the core of it is the legislative process is intentionally opaque. Right, it is designed for people not to be able to plug in and advocate. And what I've seen, and I think what people have paid attention to the sales have seen, is when enough people are able to plug in, when enough people are able to tap into the process, incredible things can happen, right? The Student Opportunity Act is the example that I always talk about when it comes to this, right? We were offered a really bad compromise last session or 2 sessions ago on the Student Opportunities Act. And rather than just accept that and feed into kind of that inertia, the thing that you talked about, Jonathan, it was more people were brought into the fold. And so I think more people need to participate, more people's voices need to be heard. And I think that we do that a couple of ways. I think one, we've got to break down the legislative process for people, for everyday people, which is something that I've done a lot. While at the State House, I co-founded this group known as Beacon Block, which is a collective of staffers of color that came together to do a few things. One of it was to improve working conditions inside of the State House to better report, retain, and support and retain staffers of color. But the other thing that we did was we've offered trainings to now hundreds and hundreds of community organizations and advocates breaking down the legislative process. I think fear of how to plug into it and the opaqueness of it is a real barrier to entry to a lot of people. And so we've been really passionate about breaking down those barriers of entry and bringing more people into the fold. And I think as state rep, I plan to continue that work, right? I think especially progressive state reps, progressive senators, we have to be organizing year round. We can't just come around and organize when it's time to get votes and when it's time to get signatures. We need to be in community year round, bringing more and more people into the fold. Because I think when more voices are heard, especially from voices from places like the 7th Suffolk District, people listen when we're able to do it. I just think we don't do it nearly enough, and it's been made far too difficult to do it.
Any other questions that people have? I'll seed another question if folks don't have one. Okay, again, so thinking of both the current holder and this current office holder in the 7th Suffolk and and her predecessor, so both China Tyler, who currently holds the 7th Suffolk, and Gloria Fox, who did before. Any ways that you would describe yourself, how would you describe yourself as similar or different to either of them in kind of how you would, what your kind of leadership approach in the building would be, priorities, however you feel like framing the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what it really comes down to is as you mentioned before, Jonathan, the State House is kind of this insular body, and we've got this Democratic supermajority, and the question becomes why doesn't more things happen? And I think what ends up happening is a lot of reps end up kind of getting into the building, becoming a cog in the system, and just kind of bending to the whims of leadership and doing what the kind of easy and convenient thing is. And I don't think you can represent a district like the 7th Suffolk and not cause a little bit of I think what has been affectionately known as good trouble. And so I think again, when I made this run, when I was talking to people about what the things that are most important to them are, it was housing, it was the environment, it was public safety. And those are the issues that our current representation is not talking about, and it is not a leader on. And I don't think you can be a representative for a community like Roxbury and Mission Hill and Fenway, not be the leader on housing, right? People get pushed out every single day. I'm actually dealing with it right now. I have to find new housing, right? Because of certain tenant protections that aren't available to me that have put me in that situation. So I think I will be the vocal leader on those issues. And I think while compromise is key and building those relationships in the building are key, you have to be willing to take a stand, and you have to be willing to be a voice for communities that have been left out of this process for far too long. And I think, my track record as an activist in the district, my track record as a co-founder of Beacon Block shows that not only do I know how to kind of take on the powers that be, but I know how to win. I know how to win tough fights with Beacon Block. We've got mandated anti-racism training for all staff and electeds for the first time ever. We got improved sexual harassment training. We got a paid internship program for the very first time, focusing on first-generation college students, as well as students from communities of color, which really opened up the doors to getting more people, with that lived experience into the building. So I've got that track record of, like I said, taking on power when it's necessary and doing it in a way that produces results.
Awesome, thank you. And then any other questions that folks have they want to chime in with? Questions going once and going twice. Hearing none. Mark, if people want to learn more about your campaign, where should they go?
Yes, you can go to, and I can also drop this all in the chat. You can go to my website, which is markforrep.com, and we're also on Facebook and Twitter. So I've dropped all of that information into the chat. And please feel free to reach out via cell phone, email, whatever, if I can answer any questions, or if you want to learn more about me.
Awesome, thank you so much for joining us. Can I get a round of Zoom applause for Mark? Awesome, thank you. And then before we go to our next speaker, I want to tag in Carol that you wanted to give an announcement.
Yes, the Ward 4 Democrats are so proud to honor one of our members who is our tireless climate change warrior, and that would be Jackie Royce. Tomorrow, Jackie is going to be honored at the Boston City Council meeting, which just happens to fall exactly on her 89th birthday. And I'm just so delighted that, Jackie is just fearless and tireless. I think that the phrase, persistence is really her hallmark. So I don't know if anybody feels like singing, but certainly raise a virtual toast to Jackie on the eve of her birthday.
I feel like it's fitting that I can raise like a reusable water bottle in Jackie's.
Perfect.
in Jackie's honor.
There you go.
Which is
Thanks,
exciting.
Jonathan.
I am always impressed by Jackie's energy level and her presence in pretty much say any climate advocacy going on in the city of Boston, and especially the neighborhoods here. So it's a well-deserved thing. Jackie, if you want to say anything, happy to tag you in. But no need to if you're busy. But that was exciting. It's well-deserved, and I love the fact that it's timed with her birthday.
Thanks, everybody. You're very sweet. I'm humbled and I'm embarrassed.
You do excellent work, and we're delighted to be able to provide it with recognition.
Thank you.
One quick thing, because I believe that we have kind of a quorum enough to address it. I had sent out as well in my notes for the meeting of seeing if folks would be up for passing a resolution in support of the State House unionization effort. So kind of last month, members over the past few years, the members of the State House staff, both the kind of the House and the Senate, have been trying to unionize given the kind of the conditions at the State House and the need for greater conditions, given that many of them are underpaid, kind of overworked and underpaid. They collected enough union cards for that and are seeking formal recognition from the Senate president, kind of on the Senate side, and wanted to see if folks would be supportive of just kind of passing a resolution in support of that State House, of the kind of the unionization effort of the staff in the state Senate. That was sent out in the kind of the email this morning. Would folks be up for doing that? If so, if anybody would like to make a motion to pass the resolution. I see a motion from Carol. Is there a second?
Seconded, John.
Okay, great. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Aye.
All those abstaining? The ayes have it. Thank you all. One other thing I quickly want to note in terms of local kind of in terms of unionization stuff, and then I'll bring in State Rep Elugardo, is some of the at least one of the Starbucks locations in Ward 4 has been attempting to unionize, and I believe that their drastically shorter hours are a union busting tactic from the management. That the location on Tremont Street in the South End has been trying to had filed for a union election in March. And I don't know about the other location in our district in the boundaries of Ward 4, which is the Dartmouth Street location. Actually, two others, the Dartmouth Street one, and then the one across the street from the Dartmouth and the hotel. They're like technically across the street from each other, but you don't see it. But thought it would be good if people can basically any ways people can express support, whether like I had sent a letter to the management at the Tremont Street location to complain about the reduced hours and praise their staff, since the reduced hours seem like it's a union busting tactic. Encourage any such efforts, and I'd be happy to for the next meeting if folks, I could draw up a resolution in support of the kind of unionizing efforts of the kind of Starbucks workers locally. Awesome. And then I will turn over the floor then to State Rep Nika Elugardo, who's running for State Senate. So Nika, I'll put you on spotlight. Take some time, tell us who you are, why you're running, all of that, and then we can do Q&A.
Thank you. Hello. It's really good to be here with Ward 4. My name is Nika Elugardo, or Elugardo if you're good in Spanish or similar languages, or Elugardo if you have certain types of Boston accents. And I answer to all of those, and I will write a variety of attempts at pronouncing the name. I'm currently a state representative. Actually, I'm just going to take myself off of spotlight because I'd rather see you guys. I am currently a state representative for 15 Suffolk, which is parts of Jamaica Plain, Mission Hill, and Rosendale on the Boston side. And I normally don't talk about the Brookline side in these second Suffolk meetings, but I'm going to here because I want you to know that I have one precinct in Brookline. And the whole town of Brookline feels that I am their representative right alongside Tommy Vitolo. And they let me know it, and they love it, and I love it too. And they feel that way because every precinct, every neighborhood in my district becomes honorary if it's adjacent. And that's kind of how I govern. And that's relevant because in the newly drawn second Suffolk district, I only have one precinct in Ward 4. I have precinct 9, I believe. And so that's right over just outside of the Brigham Circle area, and then going down towards Mass Ave. And I want you to understand that what that means to me is that I would like to be adopted by all of Ward 4. Even though you won't be able to vote for me, you will be my honorary constituents. And one of the reasons that I am running for state senate is because I currently represent 3 wonderful neighborhoods in Boston. As I said, Mission Hill, parts of Mission Hill, all of Mission Hill almost, and then parts of Jamaica Plain and Rosendale. And with the second Suffolk district, we get to add to that 4 amazing neighborhoods: Roxbury, Dorchester, Hyde Park, and a new piece of Rosendale actually. And Roxbury, Dorchester, Hyde Park, and Mattapan. So what's really important to me about that is not only that it's the first or the only majority Blacks in a district, but it's incredibly diverse and more diverse politically than my current district. And one of my specialties in the House, and actually in my 20 to 25 years prior, has been bringing together people from different spectra on the political spectra, different culture groups, different religious groups, and helping us come together and depoliticize the issues of justice. So whether that's housing for all, whether that's ecological justice for all, whether that's true economic opportunity for all, whether it's decriminalizing the BIPOC economy, whether it's decriminalizing other elements of Black and Brown life, or even just decriminalizing poverty. I know that preaching to the choir doesn't get that work done. And so I have specialized in taking on the intractable problems that no one else wants to do because they think it's a waste of time to try and get the Republicans to vote for low-income student districts to be fully funded, or they think it's a waste of time to try and get the House to pass a structural racism commission for the Department of Correction, or one of my most recent delicious wins, near wins that I'm excited about. They think it's a waste of time to get the Secretary of Public Safety to agree to pay a living wage to incarcerated people for their consulting practices that they can deliver to the legislature and to the administration to help us dismantle structural racism and inequity. When you have a relational approach, a bridge building approach in the background that I have, both academically and on the ground, and through lived experience, growing up in poverty myself, with evictions and addictions and the types of challenges, right alongside the encouragement and love I received from those same family members who were experiencing those challenges to do anything in the world that I wanted to do. When you grow up with that combination of background, you know that when you want to get something done, you have to go together as a village. And so what I have found in community meetings, not only running for state senate, but as a state rep, I found that the lion's share of the value for all of us comes from me listening to you. And so I hope that you'll dig deep and have some really strong questions, because I have been shaping over this last 2 or 3 months my policy platform, reshaping it, and it's going to be rolling out the new one. You can see on electnika.com now just what I've been using, but the new one is rolling out based on what I've been hearing in those 7 neighborhoods, right? And so I have deep experience that I'm happy to talk about. I've run a couple of statewide programs in housing and asset development, and we've done some very interesting and creative intersectional work between housing and economic development with my small businesses, with my youth, with Boston and beyond, actually, LGBTQ plus elders of color. And I've done a lot of work on climate as well. But again, I want to be guided by what's on your mind and what's on your heart. And trust me, a couple of you on the call know me well enough to know I am happy to and can go quite deep on almost any of the policy issues you might raise. And yet I love being stumped so that I can learn and come back and give you a better answer next time. So please have at. What do you want to know?
So thank you so much. So the floor is now open for questions. You can unmute and ask your question yourself. You can use the hand raise function. You can drop your question into the chat. And I'm happy to seed an opening question myself unless somebody else raises their hand. Lisa, are you raising your hand? Okay.
No, sorry. I
was so excited. I was like, look at Ward 4 coming out.
I'll ask. So one thing that since you touched on a few times was the issue of housing. So that obviously Boston has a housing affordability crisis, affordable housing crisis, however you want to kind of frame it, where more and more people are getting pushed out of the city. That I regularly hear of friends getting kind of priced out of one neighborhood to another neighborhood, or even out of the city entirely. And so a question to you is that what are the top things that you would want to be fighting for on the state level to address that crisis in Boston and statewide?
Yeah, thank you. Housing is a great place for me to sort of lay out for you what's the strategic difference between the style of leadership that I'm bringing and some of the other options that we have currently in the State House and even in this race. So it's one of the areas when I arrived where the bar was way too low. And so when I even spoke to the head of the MACDC, who I've known for many years, Joe Kreisberg, after I got elected, and said, how are we going to do housing for all? I want to do housing for all. And he said, well, right now, 4 out of 5 people in Massachusetts are housing burdened in some way that need affordable housing. They don't have it. And we're trying to get another 3 out of 4. I don't know if there's an appetite to really go for 4 out of 4 having housing. And I've just committed to trying to shift the culture in that regard. And culture shift is really critical to the housing issue as much as it is for transparency, as much as it has been for climate action. And that's because we have had for decades in this country and in this state, a real poverty and charity mindset, a scarcity mindset around housing. And what I mean by that is we think about public housing as something that's like something you give to poor people. And then when you're doing economic development in the community with market rate housing, that's sort of investment. Now, a lot of us on this call don't believe that, but that mindset has plagued our policies. And so it's what's written on the books. So what I've been working on is not only developing a full table of options that covers all of the various needs in the housing market, but backing that up with research and by getting behind my colleagues that are strong in an area. The 4 areas that we've been working on that we've beefed up this year or this session. The one that I came in that was already very strong was tenant protections. And so I am a filer of a number of tenant protections acts, including lifting the ban on rent control, which we've done a fair amount of sort of culture shift and mindset shift around, but have a long way to go to help people understand the value of rent stabilization. But number 2 is raising revenue. Now, these were the only 2 things that I felt were very strong when I came on. Now, you need to add to that supply, which the governor has led on. I used to begrudgingly say, because it's one of the few things we agreed upon, but true to character, he led on supply without making sure that that supply was equitable. And so if you make it easier to build, but you don't address the equity issues, you exacerbate the existing equity issues and exacerbate the gap, which happens in Massachusetts in education, in ecological and climate justice, et cetera. And so you have to build transit equity. You have to make sure that the housing that you're developing is accessible to the people that are the most housing burdened. And you have to develop housing that's equitable from a disability community perspective as well. And so we've been working on not only amendments to what the governor did, but continued legislation to build those opportunities out. And I've worked with the group at BU to actually identify where those parcels are. That brings me to the last of the 4 legs of the table. So you can sit at a table that has 3 legs, depending on where you put those legs, but it's going to be a little bit wobbly. We have really lacked, and this is where I've brought a lot of energy and thoughtfulness. We've really lacked actually the resources to redefine what public housing even looks like, and to redefine that in terms of all publicly owned land and resources that can be devoted to housing. It seems very straightforward, but what we've learned is there's over almost $8 billion in publicly owned land. At least 1.2 billion of that is available for affordable housing purposes. Currently, even if a public housing authority wants to access that land, they have to do 2 different sessions and 2 different pieces of legislation, get that passed. And then the procurement, the cost of doing that business is almost double what it would be for a regular developer just doing regular business. Okay. And why is that? Just because it's on the books. And so I've been working really hard with the housing committee and then got put on the housing committee. I think they've enjoyed this work with me to help people understand the untapped potential and opportunity of public resources. We can't cash our way out of this problem. So while we do need to pass the real estate transfer fee, and I have a bill, the HERO bill, that raises money for both climate and housing justice together, because you can't have one without the other. However, if we raise, that'll raise $300 million. The real estate transfer tax in Boston will raise $30 million or more. That's not going to be nearly enough to get to that 5 and 5 number. We have to use our land equity the way every other entity in the world that has land uses their equity. And right now that's impossible to do. So we can't even mobilize our tenants around tenants' opportunity to purchase right now. Even if we were to pass that law, it would be really difficult for them to get access to the land to actually do that work in cases where that was publicly owned land. So making sure that we break down what's really going on beyond what we see in Twitter, beyond what we even feel in our hearts, beyond even the symptoms that we feel presently on the ground, to see what is really the holdup here. Where is the barrier to resources? And right now, what I'm telling you is, and I'm hoping we're going to get far, we've gotten that out of housing committee twice in a row. And the chair of Ways and Means, even last session, flagged for me that this was one of their bills that they really wanted to learn more about and see if we could get done. And so Maybe we'll get it done this time. Maybe I'll still be fighting for it in the Senate. But bringing that type of intelligence to pair with the passion, and I don't mean my intelligence, I mean the collective intelligence of people who are focused on really solving a problem fully, is going to be as critical to solving the housing problem as it is some of the other issues that you've talked about today and that I listed.
Great, thank you. Any other questions that folks have?
Don't leave me hanging. Somebody said, we'll sing.
I am happy to cede other questions if folks don't have any of their own. Okay, so one thing, this is, housing is a component of this, but there are other parts of it. So I remember back in the summer of 2020, after there was heightened attention to racial justice issues, especially kind of after the murder of George Floyd, that led to kind of a discussion in the Massachusetts legislature of what needs to be happening when it comes to racial justice issues. And during those beginning times, there was a discussion of both the need for legislation around police reform, but also the fact that police reform is just one part of the issue, and that one of the other things that would need to come is investment in communities that had been historically not received the investments and the economic opportunities, and that kind of the social component to address historic injustice, as well as what one can accomplish by kind of police accountability and kind of reforming police structures. The kind of police reform part has happened. There's work still to be done on that, and that's still being implemented. Curious your thoughts on that additional step of what should be happening on the state level from, let's say, building a more equitable economy when it comes to, let's say, allocation of resources and kind of creating equitable economic opportunity in communities that like in the second Suffolk that have been kind of historically underinvested in or disinvested in.
Yeah, I've been working on that in the piece that I can do in the neighborhoods that I have. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And then there's ways that we could expand when you have the level of economic and political power that's in the 7 neighborhoods combined, which you wouldn't find in just 1 or 2. And the way I've worked on that is I start at community meetings, which don't just include the organized neighborhood associations. I have gathered youth groups. I've met with elder groups, tenant task force, to figure out what are the key issues that you want me to be addressing, and brought my platform around that. Around October of 2019, some of my kids started mugging people. And ironically, that led to the intersectional answer for how we were going to address the underinvestment issue in a way that had outcomes and wasn't just like, oh, we got somebody to put $14 million in an executive fund that nobody in my community ever knows where that money goes. It's a political win. We can talk about having done it, but there's no change on the ground. And the reason that mugging led to something positive is because we used it that way. I brought together the members of the community who cared about that, including the kids doing the mugging. And so I asked these kids, along with some other kids, because you got to have a mixed group. I asked them, what's your vision for your leadership in our community? What's your dream? And there was like radio silence, kind of like Ward 4 guys, apart from Jonathan. And I said, okay, let's play a game. So those like goofy name games, and I had gotten one of the ringleaders to help me make sure that the kids would do the corny stuff. So I knew it was corny. And I said, and we play the name game, and I said, by the end of this couple of sessions, you're going to be able to say your dream for your leadership and community as fast as you can say your name. That's what we did. And at the end of that, we combined their dreams with what I had heard from the Main Streets businesses. I had been meeting with those executive directors weekly. I still do that monthly, and other members in the community and my neighborhood associations. And we came up with a budget amendment that we decided we were going to put workforce development dollars and COVID relief. At that time, you couldn't get testing if you didn't have symptoms. So COVID relief for elders in the community that were asymptomatic but needed to go out to work as essential workers. And we were going to run it through the housing authority. You see the intersection. so that it would go to so that the jobs would go to people who lived in affordable housing and who were resistant to traditional city programming and didn't have the right types of workforce development that was culturally appropriate to how they live. And that could be provided by the people that were already working in those communities. And then we looped in the Main Streets organizations as the sub-grantees for that. And so what we ended up with was our Main Streets, because COVID hit like in the middle of those sessions. And when we got to that next Christmas, we actually had $1 million to use, which was bizarre for a first session, rep. But I was persuasive when I had these community members at my side. We asked for 2 million. I expected to get 50,000. I just asked for what I thought we needed. We got $1 million, half for the COVID stuff and half for the job stuff. And so we've been able to continue that because those investments produced over 70 jobs for youth and young adults. But the other thing that happened is that the Main Streets that got the money to pay those youth and young adults and additional money for the costs associated with training and employing them, because I come from a background where I know about overhead, guys, and so we made sure that the overhead was covered as well. I started to hear unintended positive consequences instead of unintended negative consequences, which is what I'm used to from my systems thinking work that I did for 20 years. Like the kids that used to loiter and cause trouble here are now working in this place, and their friends come by and they're policing the streets, making sure that people don't litter outside of their friend's job, because we've had those conversations. And so in answer to the question, the first half of what we have to do is think intersectionally by bringing the community members together to say, what is the need here? And what would it look like for us to meet the need for multiple groups together? Is there a way that we can creatively conceive of that? And communities, when you bring them together and build that trust, they always come up with a solution. So I've been walking the streets and talking to business owners in all the 7 neighborhoods now, and I've learned a lot about new things that need to be done. So that brings me to the second part. So there are a lot of neighborhoods, unlike where I currently represent, that have food deserts, nutrition deserts, and deserts for different kinds of basic needs that people have, such as clothing. And there are new entrepreneurs of all races, white, BIPOC, everything, who were born and raised locally, and they want to bring those resources to the communities that they grew up in or have moved to. We need to invest in those kinds of economies. And I'm hosting on May 22nd, whatever that Sunday is, just a get together for all of the women that I've met who have this kind of socially entrepreneurial model, just so they can meet each other and encourage each other. And we have to decriminalize these types of economies. So I'm a lawyer, so very often I'll utilize that to get people to tell me stuff, and they'll know it's a locked box. I'm not allowed to tell anybody if you tell me as a lawyer, right? Attorney-client privilege. And what I've learned is that so many BIPOC businesses have broken all kinds of laws or regulations or policies in order to build up the capital that they need to get started. And then they can legitimize. Sometimes they get caught and pay a lot of fees, sometimes they don't. But when you look at the things that they have done that are illegal, they're not fraud, they're not unethical, they're things that have been deemed by the mainstream as not the way you do business, despite the fact that for millennia, people have built capital using these kinds of collective economies. And so we have to, instead of criminalizing those economies or creating obstacles for people that speak other languages, to actually allow them to set up the systems that they need. They know how to do it. They know how to do it. And then we have to codify that. And so I've been working on that in different ways in the State House, testing it out, and have found my colleagues to be actually very receptive to that type of model, much more receptive than they are to being preached at about not being moral enough or caring enough about BIPOC people or poverty, which I still like to do from time to time. I'm just saying that they're not as receptive to it. And so we can be creative, and we will. And I really believe that Second Suffolk has the opportunity to actually lead the city and maybe even the Commonwealth in some of these models, just like we've quietly in our own way done in our little corner of 15 Suffolk, where I have now colleagues that are coming from other parts of the city and the Commonwealth to say, what did you do with your housing authorities? And I encourage that. And in fact, every time that we've gotten this money, we've been able to share it outside of our district, whether it was this type of investment or some other things that would be additional examples of that.
Awesome, thank you. Anybody else have any questions? No questions going once. I'm happy to give a third of my own if nobody's willing to.
I'll just ask one.
Okay.
Thank you, Ryan.
Give it a go. What are, since you represent District 4-9, not a whole lot of people, or will represent that, not a whole lot of people there, a lot of institutions, and a lot of sort of outside control that residents don't necessarily have control. So I think that also speaks to a lot of the issues we have in Boston, where we might want to do things, but we have to go through the state, through the legislature for permission. What are some areas, and you might think that's okay, but if you don't, what are some areas where you'd like to see that change, where there could be more local control?
I'm going to answer that. And first, I'm going to I neglected to introduce Isabel is here from my team. She's my manager. And she's going to go ahead and drop all that information that Jonathan's going to ask for soon. And I'll follow that up with my cell phone. And like I said, we'll be rolling out our policies there, our expanded policies responding to these questions over the month of May and June. So, speaking first to the institutional question and then to the changing from state to local control, because they kind of go together. A lot of these institutions are very large nonprofits, hospitals, universities, and they don't pay their fair share. So they're tax exempt, and they, most of them, all the big ones, sign some agreement where I've seen this paper where they say, oh, we think that the value of our tax deduction is, or our tax exemption is worth about this. And so we're going to pay this percentage of that into the community. And very few of them pay it. Most of you will be familiar with that pilot program, payment in lieu of taxes. Now there's two approaches, both of which need to be employed to mobilizing that pilot so that communities can have more resources for the local control that I'll come to in a second. Because it's one thing to say, you guys get to make decisions, but if it's sort of like another way of doing an unfunded mandate, then people just come back and say, well, you didn't do it because you didn't have the resources to do it. And so we want to bring the resources together with the power of decision making. The two approaches that we need to take, one is the carrot and sticks approach, that transactional approach. Right now, and this is a city issue really, but we have state partnership that kind of can help move this along. There are things that those hospitals need to do, they want variances, they want to develop, they want to do all kinds of stuff. And we just hand it over to them without even considering their pilot contribution as any kind of an indicator of whether or not they should be getting those types of benefits and privileges. And the list is longer than what I know about as a state rep. City councilors have, Ricardo could probably list for you a number of things that they come to the city for that they can be told no if they're not pulling their weight, given the big footprint that they put onto the communities, driving prices up and all kinds of stuff. But in addition to the carrots and stick piece, there are incentives that are on the table related to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the public resources that just lay fallow until some big business comes and has a relationship with Charlie Baker and says, can I use this land for something? And he's like, maybe yes or no, right? And that happens rarely. And so when I first met with Northeastern, before I was even sworn in, and I was thinking about this public land and how to redefine public affordable housing and as an investment model where tenants are investors too, co-investors in the public good. I went to Northeastern and I said, if we gave you like a $30 million piece of land, would that produce on your sort of balance sheet an incentive for you to develop affordable housing with the community if that was what you got in exchange? And they said, no, that's like so tiny compared to how much money we make, which kind of blew my mind. That wouldn't really like change anything. However, one of the VPs told me, if we could sell the tax credits on that land, that would be very valuable, even if we only had that privilege for a temporary amount of time, number of years. And for a long time, I didn't even know what that meant. I just kept saying it everywhere. Oh, would they be able to sell the tax credits? And it turns out there's like so many ways that we can engage those institutions through the sweetness of relationship, both economically, transactionally, but also creating opportunities where when we work together, we all get more. There's a lot of win-wins that are being left on the table. So I just want people to begin to become informed about that, because it's not a political issue, which means it doesn't get talked about. And so count on me to be your girl that's going to find the stuff that actually changes stuff, even though nobody's tweeting about it. And so the second piece of that is local control. And one of the biggest pieces where I want to see local control is in the education system. First and foremost, in our K-12. I'm absolutely against receivership. I've sat down with our current DESE commissioner, and even if I weren't absolutely against receivership, I would want that man to keep his hands fully off our districts, because he has a very top-down approach. And when I asked him about his vision for education, he started out with, well, I'm a military kid, and went from there. And so this hierarchical model that he was raised with is kind of how he's seeing how things should work. He's angry with my school, the Curley school, because they didn't do what he said. They instead did what the parents, the teachers, and the students wanted. And so we disagree on that on principle. But on the bigger principle, schools perform better when they're fully funded, first of all. And second of all, when the parents, the teachers, the educators, and the students have full voice in explaining what they want and what they need. And then the role of the state should be resourcing that. I'd like to see that in the housing world. I'd like to see that in the education world. And I'd like to see that in the small business world. Because what happens in most areas, not all areas, for example, like home ownership, there's a pretty good flow from the $60 million that the Black and Latino caucus sort of demanded for low-income home ownership. It flows into our communities. We know the people that are getting that. But very often with small business resources, bigger development resources, education resources, you're looking around, you're like, even my kids on the street programs, it's like, what are the outcomes? I did outcomes measurement for a living for a long time and trained people in that. What are the outcomes of the extra $12 million, $14 million that we put into that on the ground? And the reason we don't see those outcomes is because that money flows through big executive agencies, goes through an expensive bureaucracy, and then trickles down in the form of grants, where, raise your hand, at least in your mind, if you've ever worked for a nonprofit or a situation or on a board where you had to raise money. Did you ever stop to count up how many hours you spent getting that $50,000 grant? One of the things I used to train nonprofits is, did you spend more than $50,000 getting your $50,000 grant to do a $100,000 project? Because if so, next time, don't do that. But people don't count the value of their time, right? When they're doing public service or community service or volunteering. And so there's a tremendous amount of waste. Whereas when you would do what I did with my earmarks, it should be done, I think, outcomes-based budgeting across the board. You assess who has the strongest outcomes and you funnel the money through them. They're generally going to be people on the ground. I took the housing chair once I got appointed to the housing committee on a tour of my district. And we went to the public housing developments, and then we went to a private cooperative that had been taken over by the tenants. And then they had bought a lot of the property. And so they're now a mix of owners and tenants, and they run the whole thing. Roxbury Tenants of Harvard, right down the street from actually the precinct that I'll be representing, hopefully, in Ward 4. And his mind was blown away in what they have done over 40 years, because the investment comes straight to the members of the community. All of the money that's made goes straight back to them. They are the shareholders. And I was yesterday at St. Joseph's over in Roxbury, which is a cooperative where they have collective ownership and no mortgage. They're paid out of their mortgage, right? And so when you put the resources in the hands of the people who are the most invested in making it work and have the most creative solutions, and you bring them together with the right type of facilitation, that's the best use of even state dollars. And I think even of state policy decision-making. Did I answer your question, Ryan, or did I go on some other thing that you weren't really thinking? What made you ask that question?
No, it was good. You actually touched on things I was definitely thinking. Ward 4 is very familiar with pilot because we are so institutionalized. I wouldn't, it's probably not half our land, but it might be close, is institutional in some ways. So it was good to get your take on that because it's viewed as a city problem, but I think it's very much a state problem as well. And hearing you pivot with local control regarding education was interesting as well. So.
Well, you know, I know this about Ward 4 because I spent most of my career, my home bases were in the South End. And so I was really sad when the South End got taken out of the second Suffolk, which is why you'll especially be honorary, should I have the honor of being your state senator, because that's my stomping grounds where my daughter, I raised my daughter. We didn't live there because we couldn't afford it, but we had a lot of her youth activities there, her schooling there, my volunteerism there, and my jobs there. So yes, I'm familiar with a lot of the institutions there because I have worked with them since the 90s when I came out of school.
Final question before we go to the next speaker, Margaret.
Hi, I wondered how much you were aware of and on top of the other DESE issue, which is raising the MCAS scores, which will probably eliminate 70% of Latino students in the state from graduating from high school, and how much the House or the Senate is aware of what's going on. And is this in your, in your view here of what's going on?
High level, I am, and I hope I don't lose any of you on this, I'm an abolish the MCAS person.
So am I. I was the chair of DESE. How's that? And I am too. So, but that was.
We got to sit down. Okay, Margaret McKenna. Let's take. Please take down my number when I drop it in the chat after our talk, which obviously everyone is free to do. Again, we end up fighting over stuff. We need to take a step back and see, should we even be having this conversation?
Yeah, well.
School is supposed to equip our young people with opportunities and access to jobs, whether that's through continued education, through shades, or direct workforce development. These days I've been investigating quite a bit advanced manufacturing, which is basically just IT and technology, putting that stuff together. Kids with a certificate program can make 6 figures in 2 to 3 years. And yet these businesses are having trouble filling these positions.
Wow.
Why do we have to have pilot schools? Why do we have to have charter schools to do what we could just be doing in traditional public education, which is bringing in the need and the demand in the community to the kids' experiences, exposing them to those certificate programs early. I mean, there are schools that do that. There's a handful, this should be how we do business. And so then when we're making an assessment, the assessment isn't based on some test that people get taught to. And then the mark of a success is if you've successfully taught to the test, which isn't going to have a lot of bearing on a lot of kids' ability to pursue their dreams or even pursue a job. Okay. And so I really wish we would get rid of MCAS altogether and really rethink what it looks like to assess the child's experience becoming an active, healthy member of the community. And why aren't we putting more energy assessing mental health and behavioral health, social emotional learning skills? Because if we were, our answer wouldn't be marking a school as a failure school because if they didn't get a math score. Our answer would be, oh, we need to invest more funding in nurses and arts programs and behavioral health in the building. We need to invest more in STEAM, right? And so I think we're measuring the totally wrong stuff. And that's why you have this inequity in the outcomes. And you also see it in the MTEL, which is the test that is getting teachers into the system.
Right.
And those same inequities or similar inequities persist, where if you have a test where you have people that have the same level of education and Black people are failing it more than white people, the thing shouldn't be like, oh, what's wrong? What do we got to do differently with the Black people and the brown people? The thing should be like, oh, the test is biased. When I came out of MIT, I eventually was going to go to Harvard. And at MIT, at the time that I went, there were no sociology courses offered of any kind. And, it's a science school. So I was going to go to policy and I had to take the GRE. And so I had to figure out what subject GRE, I had to take a subject GRE. And I went to a university that didn't have any of the subjects that the GRE had, except all the science one, which isn't what I was doing, right? And so the closest thing I could find was sociology. I took the sociology GRE and I aced it because it was all stuff from like my childhood. And it was like, what do you do when your dad's an alcoholic? And like, what do you say to a kid who, what happens when you say this nasty racist thing to an indigenous person, like A, B, C, D, or E? And I was just like, are they serious? Like, what are these questions? And I came out and there were two young white women who I think, just based on accents and things, had probably grown up in white suburbs. And they were lamenting about how hard that test was. And they were sociology majors. So that was just the case where I experienced it on the other end, where it's like, I didn't study for this test. I had never taken a course in it, but it kind of just spoke to my life. And so I aced it and I went to Harvard. But these girls who didn't have that life experience were like straining to figure out what they had learned, I don't know how they did. But my point is, those types of biases exist. And we need to make it a rebuttable presumption, but a presumption that if there's disparate outcomes, the test is racist, the test is sexist, the test is anti-whatever the person is that's not able to, at the same level as others, make it through. And so this whole, it's not, we say Western mentality, which isn't even accurate, because there's just like, when I studied Western music in college, it's just like Vienna and then like 100-mile radius around that, which isn't even Western Europe, really. There's just like a few places in the world that have sort of dominated a kind of monarchy type of thinking that has been infused into our way of doing education and assessing things that basically professionalizes failure. Because a few people are benefiting from it, we think it's doing all right. Just like Governor Baker and I used to have these arguments around disaggregate your data, man. Stop talking about how Massachusetts is the best in education, the best in public health, the best in et cetera. You got to break those numbers down and see that the gaps are enormous. And he finally did listen when it came to COVID, and he did disaggregate then. Did I answer your question, Margaret?
No, I agree with all of that, except it will pass in the MCAS thing will pass in June, and 70% of Latino kids will fail. And we already have the largest achievement gap in the country, and it's a disaster. And unless we have we have a Democratic governor and a whole new DESE board, these kids are going to suffer for another 5 or 10 years. It's terrible.
You know what I don't get, Margaret? What I don't get is why people.
Since we do have one more speaker, if you can be quick.
Yeah. Yes, I'll be quick.
We can talk about this offline.
I will finish by saying this.
Yeah.
When anyone, and particularly any group in our community, is being harmed by a system that we're using, we got to remake the system.
Yeah, I agree.
And that basic mindset shift is where we need to move. And I've been working on that. And my colleagues are starting to get it in small doses. Like, we got a unanimous vote. And one day I'll tell you guys the story of how we got that unanimous vote on the low income education funding part of the Student Opportunity Act. So Isabel has dropped the information for my campaign there. I will drop my cell phone. But please do reach out. We'd love to have you be part of Team Nika, even if you're not in Precinct 9, guys. I'm going to be there for you and really for the Commonwealth. So I hope I can earn your vote by September 6th.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And can I get a round of applause for Nika? And then I'll bring up Miniard Culpepper. If you're here, I will put you on spotlight. and then take it away.
I am here.
And so feel free, tell us a little bit about who you are, why you're running, and then we can do some Q&A.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Ward 4, for allowing me to talk to you tonight. My name is Miniard Culpepper, and I'm running for the state Senate seat in the 2nd Suffolk District. And it's interesting because I wanted to just pick up on a couple of things that Representative Elugardo was talking about with regard to housing. And I know she talked about the co-ops and how they now own them. I want to talk a little bit about, since we're talking about home ownership being transferred, in this case, through a program that we did at HUD. You may know that I worked at HUD for 27 years as a regional counsel for New England for Region 1. I oversaw all the lawyers for 27 years in Region 1. One of the programs that we did was called the Demonstration Disposition Program that I worked closely with, oversaw, helped rewrite the regs that implemented it, that oversaw it. It was a program that Congress created called the Demonstration Disposition Program. And it was a program that would allow HUD to take their inventory of multifamily housing that we had brought in through the insurance and foreclosure and defaults and rehab it, transfer it to the tenants. Boston was the only city in the country that went forward with their demonstration disposition program. And the reason why I raised it is because Representative Elugardo was talking about home ownership. What we did was we took housing developments like Canfield Gardens. Many of you in the South End know Canfield Gardens is right behind People's Baptist Church. We demolished it, built it brand new, and we transferred it to the Tenants Association. Those tenants now own what is called Canfield Estates. It's no longer Canfield Gardens. I oversaw that program at HUD. We also did the same thing with Academy Homes in Roxbury. Demolished it, tore it down completely, built it up brand new, transferred it to the tenants. We did that with 18,000 units. We either transferred the units directly to the tenants, not individually, but Canfield Gardens, the tenant association is the owner of that development. For the Academy Homes apartment development, the tenants own that entire development. For Franklin Park on Seaver Street, we did the same thing. We didn't demolish those, but we rehabbed them, and then we transferred them to the tenants. The tenants are now the owners of those developments. And the reason why I think that's important is because when you look at gentrification and when you look at what's happening in the city of Boston today, and you look at the cost of renting or owning, it's going out the roof. And if we don't find a way to stabilize gentrification, then we're going to have a city where only the haves can live here. I lived in the South End. In fact, all through law school, I was able to live on Greenwich Park in the South End. I couldn't do that today if I was a law student because the cost of living for me at a law student at that time, I worked nights as a security guard to pay for law school. I couldn't do that today because I wouldn't be able to afford it. When you look at what we've done at HUD, when you look at, for example, Canfield Gardens, Lenox Street, a housing development that's owned by the Boston Housing Authority, is right next to it. And if you look at Lenox Street versus Canfield Estates, you'll say, oh my God, why is one brand new in great condition and the one next to it is falling apart? I believe that we can do the same thing with the state. We can have a state demonstration disposition program that takes those housing developments, that rehabs those housing developments, that trains the tenants in ownership. And that's what we did at HUD. We had session after session after session with those tenants. They are now the owners. They also hired management companies, but we trained those tenants over the time that they were rebuilding it to become the tenant owners of that association. I think we can do the same thing with many of the state-owned housing developments in the city of Boston. Those with the Boston Housing Authority, I think we can do the same thing with those that are owned by the Boston Housing Authority, that we can transfer them to the tenants because it stabilizes not only their tomorrow, but it stabilizes their future. I believe that housing is one of the most critical issues in this election. I've worked on housing all of my life. I think housing stabilizes and home ownership stabilizes communities and neighborhoods. I think it affects the health and well-being of families. I think it drives development, business, and jobs. And I think housing plays a role in public safety and in criminal justice. I believe that housing determines neighborhoods. And so because I have worked not only to demolish, rebuild, and transfer to tenants the housing and train them to be the owners of those housing, I think that's part of one of the solutions for the future and how we take it from tenants to just being renters to tenants to be owners. And so when I look at what I've done, I looked at my housing background, I looked at what we needed in this race, and I believe that we can take it to the state. I believe that when we built 202 811, those are senior housing developments in the city of Boston and around the state. I believe that we can have a state 202 811 program that builds senior housing, something that's desperately needed in the city of Boston. I believe we can have a senior housing program the same way we did on the federal government. The amazing thing about many of these housing developments that we built brand new or that we renovated, folks don't realize that it was the federal government that actually rebuilt Orchard Gardens, that it was the federal government that actually rebuilt Mission Hill, that it was the federal government that actually rebuilt Geneva Avenue, that Schuyler, Maple, Sonoma Street, and Dorchester, it's the federal government that did that. And I was right there helping to rebuild this community in a way that I think if we all work together, we can stabilize, we can take and look at gentrification in a way that it will build up the community that we all participate. I was born in Boston, grew up in Boston. I've been here, this is my life. Housing is my passion. But I also believe that those of us that have been here all of our lives and that helped to build up the Boston to the Boston that it is today, the prosperous Boston, I believe that we have to fight for those that are not as fortunate as we are and to make it possible for them to participate in the prosperity and the benefits that Boston is now seeing. So I'm in this election. I'm willing to fight for the 2nd Suffolk Senate District. I'll fight for affordable housing. I'll fight against the gentrification. I'll fight to keep dumping out of our communities because folks come into this community and in the middle of the night, they dump things and we wake up the next morning. I will fight for a cleaner community. I will fight for equity against bigotry and blight. I've been doing it all my life. And so I believe that it's time. I believe that it's my time to stand up and take my experience and my fight and the leadership to the legislature as a state senator from the 2nd Suffolk District. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you, and I'll entertain any questions that there may be. Thank you, Jonathan.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. Any questions? And again, feel free to raise your hand and either unmute and ask your question, use the hand raise function, or put your question in the chat. And happy to seed some starter questions if nobody has one to start. Not seeing any starting questions. I'll go with one. How would you describe your how would you describe your kind of leadership style? Actually, no, I'll tag Lisa and then I'll ask mine. Lisa, go.
Oh, sure. There's a bill that I've been pushing for a lot lately, and I'm curious where you stand on it. It's Bill H225, and it is to make the use of aversives illegal for students in Massachusetts and educational facilities. Right now, the law is different for children that are disabled versus abled. So the protections aren't the same, and there's less for disabled individuals. So I'm curious where you stand on that, or if you're
Lisa-
familiar with the bill.
Lisa, I believe that there should be equality and balance, especially with our students that are challenged. One of the amazing things about schools, and when I look at where we are in terms of equity, and where I look at where we are in terms of, in Elizabeth Warren's own words, leveling the playing field, I think we have a long way to go. I'm not sure if you know Edith Sadberry, but Edith Sadberry has been doing a lot in terms of trying to bring equity to the disabled students in the Boston school system. I was talking with her earlier about DESE. She was having a meeting about it, and I'm for it 100%. I think that for our students, I think we need to give them every opportunity that they can to succeed. And when you look at what's happening in the school system now, it's just not happening. I believe something real basic. When we went, the schools closed because of COVID. The school system sent computers to all of the students. And I thought that was a great thing. But what they didn't do was all of the students don't have Wi-Fi. And so that means that the students that didn't have Wi-Fi didn't have access to use the computers the same way that students that were provided with Wi-Fi. I think we really need to assess our system. And I think sometimes you need to remake the system in order to bring in equity. And I believe 100% that that's what we can do with that bill. I stand with you, I support it, and I will fight for it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, and then any other questions folks have? And again, I can see one if folks don't. So question, how would you describe yourself as similar or different in leadership style or priority to the current senator, Sonia Chang Diaz, who represents the 2nd Suffolk, although in a slightly different configuration than what the district will look like on the ballot this fall?
Right, Jonathan, thank you for the question. One of the things that I think is important for me as a state senator is to look at my experience, not just in Dorchester, but across the district. And one of the things that when we grew up in Boston, it was amazing the difference between when we grew up and today, because we were all over the city. There wasn't one part of the city that we were refined to or restrained to. We were all over the city. And so when I look at one of the differences, I want to bring resources across the district. I think that the State House and the budgets, I think we assess what the needs are in our community, and based on our needs, going to the community, listening to the community. I want to hear from the 2nd Suffolk District, for folks that live in the 2nd Suffolk District. I want to hear from them what they believe their needs are. I mean, it's easy as a legislator to determine what the needs are, but I think it's critical that you hear from every part of this district, to hear what their needs are, to take the needs that you hear from them and to shape those needs, and then develop legislation based on the needs that you hear from your district. Because many times the needs that are in the district are not being met. I worked on Capitol Hill for a congresswoman as her chief of staff. And one of the things that she did, she spent more time in that district listening to the residents and listening to the needs of the district. And I think as a state senator, that's the way I would operate. I want to hear from those in the 2nd Suffolk District. I want to hear what their needs are. I want to hear what they think we can bring to them from the State House. And based on what I hear, I believe that you then begin to shape legislation to meet the needs of those that are telling you what they need in order to bring it to the district. That's the kind of state senator I would be.
Great, thank you so much. And any other questions from folks? And again, you can either drop a question in the chat, raise your hand, or unmute and ask it yourself. Hearing no further questions, Reverend Culpepper, if you could drop into the chat where people can go if they want to learn more about your campaign. And can I get a round of applause?
John, can I just say one thing?
Yes.
One of the things that I've said I would do when elected as a state senator, that we look at the Community Reinvestment Act, and we look at the Community Reinvestment Act, something that Massachusetts also adopted, and we look at the obligations that place on financial institutions to invest in the community, to make loans in the different communities. What I've said I would do, as soon as I got to the State House, I would craft and file a piece of legislation that it would be called the Massachusetts Community Sustainability Act. And what that would do, that it would require financial institutions, banks, hedge funds, private equity funds to invest in the communities to improve the environmental quality of the communities that they serve and that they continue to represent. I think that it's important that we look at what's available, that we look at the private equity firms, that we look at hedge funds, that we look at banks, and that just like we do with the Community Reinvestment Act, that under the Massachusetts Community Sustainability Act, we would also place an obligation on them, an affirmative obligation, that they invest in the communities that are dealing now with climate change issues, that deal with mitigation projects, something real basic like insulation for some of the homes that those hedge funds can invest in and make grants available to homes to bring insulation to their homes. That would do two things. That would not only save money on the heat bill for those homes, but it would also give them extra money that they can use to invest in other things. And so I think there are things that I'm already thinking about that I would do. One of them has to do with the environment. And I think we have to be laser beam focused on environment in ways and solutions that we can make change to have a better community to live in. Look, I thank you for having me, Ward 4. Look, I look forward to continued dialogue with you. Ask me the tough questions. I'll put my number in the chat where you can just give me a call personally. And look, I'll see you and I'll be on the street talking to you. Anything that I can do for you, let me know. But I'm looking for your support. I look for you to stand with me and fight with me on the issues that we both believe in. And I think that way we can bring victory to this 2nd Suffolk District. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Kind of round of applause for kind of Reverend Culpepper. And then